Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the top 5 challenges to the SQF code version 8. My name is Holly Cardozo, and I'm a member of the marketing team with SAI Global, and I'm pleased to welcome you today. Before we begin, we'll just speak to a few housekeeping slides so that you know how to interact with us during the webinar. Firstly, if you can see us but you can't hear us, I'll invite you to refer back to your registration link. This will get you to both seeing and hearing the presentation. There's 2 ways that you can interact with us during the webinar. One is through our quick poll questions. We only have one for today at the start of the webinar. So I invite you to select the response that's presented on the screen based on the question, and we'll share the results so you can see how you sit amongst your peers. And the other way is through the question and answer box. In the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see 3 small arrows. Select that, type your question, and I invite you to do so as you think of them. And we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. You can collapse that box off to the right of your screen by clicking those 3 small arrows again. And I'll remind everyone that we're recording the webinar, and we'll send a link to the recording after the webinar within 2 business days, along with the slides as well. So with that, I'll introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Bob Strong. He's one of our senior consultants and trainers with SAI Global. A wealth of information and helps to support clients in food safety operations in the areas of GMP, many GFSI standards, including, of course, SQF, BRC, and FSSC 22000. He's worked in a number of different roles and capacities within the food industry, and as I mentioned, is one of our consultants and trainers, and a wealth of information. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Bob.
Holly, I can't see your slide right now. Okay, now I can. All right, good afternoon, good morning to everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. I feel really honored that I get a lot of you coming back to each of our webinars every time we have them. And obviously this is a very topical subject right now. And the information that I'm going to present to you, I gathered this from both our certifying body and also from attending the SQF annual meeting that was held in Atlanta back in October. What was the SQF version 8? And for the top 5 that were identified are food fraud, and we'll talk about each of these separately on what we found with the auditors were reporting. We'll also talk about possibilities of how you can handle these challenges if you're having these challenges as well, because obviously with these being the top 5, these are where more companies were having challenges this year than they'd had with version 7.2. Environmental monitoring was the second one. Surprisingly, equipment and building maintenance still ranked high. Food safety plans, which is not maybe surprising, seeing that SQF requires HACCP, but also requires you to meet the FDA requirements, which means you have to have food safety plans, and people may be being confused on that. Verification and validation, and last but not least, we'll talk to you about tips to how you could overcome these challenges. So we're going to do a little poll just to get a feel for what you feel your challenges are so that I can use that as I'm talking to the different slides for the rest of this presentation.
Yeah, that's great, Dr. Bob. Thank you. So which area has your organization found to be the most challenging? So let me launch, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to select your response. What's been your experience, Dr. Bob? Is it sort of a blended approach, many areas of challenge? And
I think it depends on what you are. I think pretty well everybody had some challenges with food fraud, and I think we still do. I think environmental monitoring, depending on the type of product you're making. The others, I'm a little bit surprised that some of these showed up in the top 5 when basically we've been talking about these things for the last several years.
Yep, sure. Lots of discussion, certainly of late, on food fraud. So unsurprisingly, let me close and share the results here. That is the top response. So 40% of folks on the call today said that food fraud is the most challenging, and kind of the balance of the 3: environmental monitoring, equipment and building maintenance, and verification and validation.
Good. Well, it basically seems to summarize what everybody else has been having the SQF audits this year. The version 8 has found as well. So let's go through these now one at a time, and let's talk about what the challenges the auditors were finding, what responses we were hearing at the SQF meeting and what we were hearing maybe from clients who were somewhat obviously a little concerned that they weren't where they needed to be. So let's start off with the big one, food fraud, which was only entered into the SQF audit this year for the first time, even though it's been in other GFSI audits for at least a couple of years. So what does the code say? I'm not going to read this to you because you're going to get a copy of the slides, but I just wanted you to understand that food fraud was added to the SQF code. It is a standalone program, and you have to have a program, and it is based into 4 sub-elements, and the sub-elements describe what you have to have in this plan, yet apparently companies didn't understand one, maybe they didn't need to have a plan, or 2, they didn't understand how detailed their plan had to be. So we're going to now run through some of the things that we have seen as the challenges to having a food fraud program. I think one of the problems was some companies didn't realize it was even added to version 8, which means that I would just caution you to be sure you make sure that you keep up to date when SQF issues things. And it's not like it came as a surprise because SQF put out version 8 at the beginning of last year. In fact, it was available in March of last year in detail, and in there it said you have to have a food fraud program. But some people thought food fraud and food defense was the same, so they didn't do anything. They said, oh, we got it covered under food defense. And the auditor came in and said, no, food defense is one, food fraud's another. They're separate programs. You don't have a program, you lost 10 points. And they went, wow. Because that took you immediately out of excellent down into the next category. Some companies said, well, I don't know how to address it. So they didn't do anything, which you can't do either, because the auditor is not going to help you out. That's not the role of an auditor. When the auditor comes in, you don't have something, he slaps you with a major. Some companies felt they were exempt, and in some companies they may have been exempt. But you can't not do a fraud and risk assessment to justify being exempt, and that has to be documented why you feel you're exempt from food fraud. They also didn't realize it affects another program. And that program is the Approved Supplier Program, because in the Approved Supplier Program, it references the food fraud program, and it says that you have to make sure that you're identifying that all your suppliers have food fraud programs so that they don't send you accidentally something that's fraudulent. So some companies got hit twice. They got hit in the Approved Supplier Program, and they got hit in the food fraud program. And that could mean 10 plus 1, 11 points off, you're down to 89. And now it's a little late because the auditor discovered that. Now you're scrambling to get the food fraud program put together so you can, in the next 30 days, get back with the auditor and say, we've corrected our problem. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges? First of all, writing the program. I think one of the challenges for all of us is, what do I put in a food fraud program? What is food fraud? How do I know it affects me? Well, one of the things you have to do is you have to do a little homework, because the FDA is coming along in the next few years to ask you for a food fraud program as well, and they've been a little slow in trying to give us much guidance. But I'll show you in a minute that in SQF, and there are a few other places you can go and get some guidance. But you have to write a program. You have to have something. And you have to take each ingredient that you buy, and you have to determine, is it a potential for food fraud? If it isn't, then you justify that it's not. An egg looks like an egg, so therefore how could you make a false shell egg? Or a banana that looks like a banana, or something when it's very obvious that what you're buying is what you're getting. The problem is when it's a white powder, how do you know it is what you're buying? And therefore, is it likely to be fraud? Because then you've got to develop a mitigation strategy to avoid where there's a possibility of food fraud. And according to the FDA, it's $1 billion industry now throughout the world. It's not just a North American problem, it's a problem throughout the world, where the bad guys have decided to try and sell you something that isn't what you're buying. Now, in some cases, it's not a food safety problem, but unfortunately, as they're not that smart, the people selling it to you, sometimes it is. Therefore, your supplier also has to have a food fraud program, because if they're going to supply you an ingredient, and then in that they're buying ingredients, or they're buying from certain parts of the world, what are they doing to make sure they're getting what they're supposed to be getting when they send it to you? So you have to know that your suppliers all have food fraud programs. So knowing where to go to get help, and that's what we'll try to give you some leads on where to go get help. The next slide, please. SQF has actually written the guidance documents. I'm not sure that everybody realizes that. If they haven't, then it's right on the SQF website. It offers guidance not only you, but also to the auditors, because the auditors were also wanting to know how would I spot food fraud, how would I look for food fraud, what should be in a food fraud program. So it has been a challenge to the auditors as well. So in order to try and get ahead of the game, SQF issued a guidance document. So I would suggest you go to the SQF website, and we've given you the link there, and you download it, and it'll give you some guidance. Michigan State University has actually set online monthly training classes on food fraud, free. So you can go to the Michigan State University and you can find their food fraud online monthly classes and basically get on them and listen to what they say. John Spink there at Michigan State is one of the leading authorities in food fraud. He's made this a mission, and so he's a very knowledgeable professor. And he's offering online monthly training classes which are free to you. So use that. SSAFE has a food fraud vulnerability assessment tool, which comprises of about 50 questions that will stimulate your thoughts on what you should be asking your suppliers, what you should be looking for. So again, I would suggest that you download that assessment tool, and maybe you customize it because some of the questions may not be applicable to your ingredients, and use that to evaluate your suppliers. PwC, Price Waterhouse, has an article on food fraud as well, and we've given you the website to that. I have to agree that there isn't an awful lot of advice that we can give you, or anybody's giving you right now on food fraud. Maybe over the next few years, as we get to know more and more about food fraud, we'll all get better at it. But right now, you have to have a program. You have to have something in writing. You have to have done something. You can't just sit back and say, I'll wait until I know more about it, when you're losing 10 points on your SQF audit. Next slide. So that's food fraud, which obviously 40% of you said you had issues with, and it turned out to be actually the number one problem that SQF identified at this year's annual meeting. The next one, of course, is pretty new, but it is not new, meaning it just showed up. It was there before. It was before under the GMP module, so it was under module 11. SQF moved it in version 8 into the systems elements to give it more emphasis. It is also tied in with the fact that the FDA and the USDA require you to do environmental monitoring when you have ready-to-eat foods. And so therefore, it's actually not mandatory, though in some cases people think it is mandatory. It's not mandatory in the SQF code, but it's almost mandatory because you have to justify not having a program, and whereas you could just say, I didn't think it applied to me, so I didn't do anything. And that's what I say at the bottom. It's not mandatory for all, but it is considered mandatory for those in which high-risk food is processed, handled, or exposed, and it's mandatory to meet the FDA's requirements in packaging ready-to-eat foods. And you can add on, it's also mandatory in USDA plants. But you could justify asking for an exemption. But remember, to get an exemption, you have to present your case to the certifying body ahead of time before the auditor comes in saying why you don't feel environmental monitoring applies in your plans. And if the certifying body will give you an exemption, which will be, it doesn't mean they won't, it just means they'll be rather exceptional if they do. But if you can justify it, you can get an exception. If it has a big M after it, and remember a big M in SQF means mandatory, and then nobody can give you an exemption. So let's talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. So therefore, what were the challenges the auditors were finding? They found companies had no environmental swabbing program at all. They hadn't asked for an exemption when they could have possibly qualified for an exemption. So if you're not going to ask for an exemption and not therefore get an exemption, then don't expect the auditor to give you a break. He's not. Then when they went when they did have a problem, they failed to identify what pathogens were they going to be swabbing for. Were they going to swab for Listeria species, Salmonella, or a Enterobacteria, an indicator organism? Were they going to swab for E. coli? And then you have to do that based on risk. There was no risk assessment for the environmental swabbing program on why they were swabbing for some things and not swabbing for some things. And therefore, there was no justification for the frequency at which they were swabbing. And the auditor found that they were just basically doing a few swabs so they could show the auditor that they'd done some swabbing, but they were only doing this so the auditor couldn't say you weren't doing swabbing. And then they were swabbing after they cleaned and sanitized. Well, you're swabbing to try to find the environmental pathogen. Well, you want to find it, so you swab when it's in the worst conditions, because that Listeria can't be in that room at any time, whether it's a dirty room or a clean room. And therefore, if you're going to only swab when it's clean, the chances are you're never finding it because you just got rid of it, but yet it's still in the room, but where you're swabbing, it isn't there because you just cleaned, sanitized, and then swabbed. But you're not finding the reservoir. And the reservoir is where it's leaking from. It's leaking from, it's seeping from, which quite often means it's in a crack, it's in a crevice, it's somewhere, and it's being flushed out by a high-pressure water hose when the sanitation people are doing their job, or it just oozes out during production. Well, you need to know it's there. Well, you need to know it's there when it's dirty, and then if you clean up and it's gone, then at least you say you're getting rid of it, but are you getting rid of it from where the reservoir is? And then one of the challenges is trying to keep people out of this packaging room if you're making ready-to-eat food who don't need to be in there. And therefore, what the auditor were finding was they weren't restricting the staff to only the staff that should be in that room. And so the auditor's taking off points. And sometimes it's a major point, sometimes it's minor, but as you add up minors and minors and minors, sometimes your whole program therefore becomes a major, and you lose 10 points again. Next slide. So you say to yourself, well, where can I get help? Because this is new. It's only come around in the last few years. The government's coming after us about it, and we haven't been a USDA plant that's been doing it for years, and FDA's only started doing it in the last couple of years, and SQF hasn't required it except for the last couple of years, and now it's getting a lot more emphasis. So, man, I need help. Where can I go get this? Well, one of the places you can get it from is the companies who sell environmental swabs certainly know a lot about where to swab and how to swab and that type of thing. So I would suggest that you talk to some of them. I would suggest you try to limit the size of this packaging area because you're not required to be swabbing your whole plant. What you've got to swab is where the ready-to-eat product is exposed. Therefore, there's a high probability that if there's an environmental pathogen in that area, it could be in the air and getting on that product that you're about to package, and it's a ready-to-eat product, so nobody's going to do anything with it except don't the packaging get sick. So if your packaging area is just part of a large room, you've got a big challenge. You may want to feel and see how you can wall off, shield that area, somehow reduce the size of that area. Then you need to map this area. And you need to get down on your hands and knees, and you need to crawl all over the floor looking for where you've got legs, where the caulking has started to come away from under the legs, and that's where the Listeria is living under the legs, and it oozes out. Or you find that you've got dirty cart legs on carts that are wheeled into this room. Or you find that you've got a crack over in the floor or in the wall. Or you've got hollow legs, and it's inside the hollow legs, and the hollow legs don't have a bottom to them except a little pinhole. So in other words, you've got to go looking for it. And so you've got to be willing to get down and get dirty, get wet, get on your belly, and basically get down there and try to find it. If you're just swabbing in the easy to reach areas, those are also the easy to clean areas, and that's not where the Listeria is most probably living. You say, okay, once I've mapped it out and I've come up with, let's say, 100 different sites. Do I have to do 100 sites every week? No. Do I have to do all 100 sites every 2 weeks? No. What you do is you randomize by getting a randomized software program, but you have to determine how many swabs am I going to do? Am I going to do 10 a week? And am I going to do 20 every 2 weeks? What am I going to do? And I've identified areas where I think the listeria, the salmonella could be. And I'm going to swab them. And now I'm going to make sure that the software program picks them. And if it's a random good program, it should pick all 100. If you're picking 10 a month or 10 a week, hopefully over the 10 weeks, the 10 months, it picks all 100. But that doesn't mean you don't vary how frequently you're going to do. Because if you're finding the listeria in certain areas, you'd want to increase the frequency. And if you're not finding it in other areas, you may want to decrease the frequency. The scary thing is, are you missing it? And then it shows up in your product. Then you got a class 1 recall, and then you got regulators coming in. And they're coming in to do what they call a swabathon. And they're taking 200 to 300 swabs. And so therefore, again, you have to say to yourself, why are they doing that? Because they don't want to leave any area unturned. They want to go full bore, and that's how you should start off. And then start decreasing it, decreasing it, decreasing it. But if you're making a ready-to-eat product, you can't decrease it to where you don't have a program at all. Next slide. So therefore, you got to deal with pathogen or indicator organisms you're going to swab for. Most people are not doing Listeria monocytogenes, they're doing Listeria species. Then you say, well, should I then carry on the analysis to see if it's Listeria monocytogenes? No, don't waste your money. React as if it is, because you don't want any Listeria of any type there. Rather, you're going to spend more days, more money trying to determine is it monocytogenes. It indicates you've got some type of a environmental cleaning program problem. You got a reservoir somewhere. So be aggressive. Attempt to find it. Don't attempt not to find it. Therefore, one of the things the FDA says, if you read some of the preamble that they put together, they say that you should incentivize your people to find it, not incentivize them not to find it. Swab always before cleaning and not after cleaning. Because if you can't find it when it's dirty, it sure as heck ain't there when it's clean. But if you're going to clean it up and sanitize it and then say, I can't find it, I mustn't have it, then you're fooling yourself. Do not swab food contact surfaces is my advice in an FDA regulated facility, because you don't have to by law. USDA doesn't give you that option. You have to do food contact surfaces. But remember, once you swab a food contact surface, and you're supposed to swab it while the food's still on it, it's dirty, then you have to hold all the product that was on that food contact surface since the last time you swabbed it in order to make sure that that product doesn't contaminate and you can't let it go out the door. Restrict people, pallet jacks, pallets, forklifts. Try to keep out of this room everything you possibly can and dedicate stuff to this room so that you don't have to worry about bringing it in on just anybody's shoes or on any pallet jack or on a forklift that goes from the dirty end, and I use that in italics, dirty end of the plant to the clean end. You may want to consider the positive air pressure in this area. If you believe that it's blowing into this area, you may want to go to a positive air pressure. Now, that's not going to be easy, and I'm not saying do that. I'm saying that maybe one of the things. What are you heading? You're heading to having this area closed down by the FDA. If you've got Listeria monocytogenes in this room and you're making a ready-to-eat product, there is going to be no option. The FDA is going to finish up closing you down. And they're going to keep you closed until you can prove the Listeria is not in that room again. And that won't be a short downtime. That'll be months, could be longer than months, could be 6 months, and you don't want to get there. So you want to be ahead of the regulators. Again, who's your biggest threat? The regulators, not the SQF auditor. Yeah, they're going to take off points, but the FDA is going to have the power to close down your ready-to-eat packaging area. They have the right to seize your product, etc. Next slide, please. So let's move on. Those are obviously the two biggest hitters, and I think you all indicated they were the two biggest hitters that you were worried about, but you had a couple of others that were pretty close to the environmental monitoring, and one of them was equipment and building maintenance. which again seems to be surprising, seeing this has been in the SQF audit for years. It's just that, unfortunately, I think some people don't quite understand what is the content that I've got to have. What is the auditor looking for? And they basically were cited under 11.2.10.1 and 11.2.10.2, which basically talks about who's going to do it, when you're going to do it, etc. So next slide. So what is the issue under 11.2.10? You have to have a written program, and it has to include the entire plant equipment in the building. And yet auditors are going in finding that the preventive maintenance program covers some things. Maybe it covers the equipment, doesn't even mention the building. Maybe it doesn't cover all the equipment. But then you have to say who's going to do it. And that has to be in your program. Is it going to be done by your own people? Is it going to be done by a contract service provider? And therefore, now we get into the contract service provider being identified and has to be trained and has to understand they're in a food plant, etc. And then we have to make sure that we have a plan on what we're going to do when equipment breaks. And we can't fix it right away because we're halfway through the afternoon and we've got to keep going for a couple of hours. Well, the good news is actually SQF allows temporary repairs. Because if you remember in 7.2 in previous versions, no temporary repair was allowed in an SQF audited facility. They've begun to realize that that's not real well. There are times when you're going to have to do temporary repairs, but you have to make sure that temporary repair isn't going to finish up contaminating the product. But there was nothing mentioned in the 11.2.10 in version 8 written by the company to say what they did when they had temporary repairs to make sure they didn't finish up contaminating the product. Next slide. So what 11.2.11 preventive equipment challenges? The preventive maintenance schedule based on equipment manufacturers' recommendations. They couldn't explain their schedule. They couldn't say where they got the frequency from. And it's obviously it's based on the equipment manufacturer's recommendations, and you should be able to show that to the auditor. And then you can increase that frequency as your equipment gets older, but you can't have any lack of justification for the frequency of the preventive maintenance. So therefore, sometimes you need a software program to handle it, which will trigger that it's time for a PM on a piece of equipment. And when you don't do it, it'll send you another alert saying you haven't done it and the day's come and gone, because that's something the auditors find, that you go past the date and nobody catches it. And the next time it's a month past the date, 2 months past the date, and there's nobody explaining why you didn't do it and what happened. And maybe you couldn't do it exactly when it came up in the schedule. But you need to enter something into the system saying why you have delayed it and justification for delaying it. If you're going to say you're going to have it done by your own people, you make sure you got enough in-house maintenance personnel to do it. Or you got to have a budget to hire contractors. I've been myself personally into plans where they had 4 maintenance guys. They went down to 3. The management said, well, let's see how we can get along. Then after they got along with 3, which they didn't get along real well, but they got along, they went down to 2. And management said, hey, why don't we try and see if we can get by with 2? And they finished up with 1 guy working second shift, 1 guy working first shift, and somebody having to come in the middle of the night when stuff went down in the middle of the night, and it wasn't working at all. But senior management felt it was a great cost saving. Well, you can't get caught up in that, because remember, the basis of SQF is providing adequate resources. But then you have to have downtime to do this preventive maintenance. So if you actually have a lot of orders and a lot of production and you're running 7 days a week, then preventive maintenance is going to get neglected. And now the auditor comes in and starts looking at your preventive maintenance schedule, starts looking at your records, and you're not doing what you say you're doing, and you're starting to lose points. So you can see why this was one of the top 5 as well, because they weren't generally tracking the maintenance of the work as needed. And therefore, they didn't have very good records. And the records they'd say when their things were delayed, why they were delayed. What was the justification for delaying it? Or if you decrease the frequency, what was the justification for decreasing the frequency? Well, it could be that you never have breakdowns. The equipment's pretty reliable. You're able to stretch it from every 3 months to every 4 months, but you've got justification for that to show the auditor. No justification, then obviously the auditor is going to say, I'm not sure you got any basis for the frequency of your preventive maintenance, and your records indicate you don't seem to even be following the schedule you've got. Next slide. So again, that's the top three. So now let's talk about ones that still were up amongst the top five. And that means there are many other things that were minors and people were losing points. But I just selected the top five. The food safety plan obviously is something that's come along in the last couple of years because the FDA has decided that you need to have food safety plans. But SQF also changed things on you. If you go back and look at the food safety plan under 2.4.3 in addition 7.2, I think it had about 5 or 6 sub-elements. They took it this year and made it into 17 separate sub-elements. Now, there's nothing in there that really wasn't in there before, but by separating it into the 17 sub-elements, they were able to highlight each of the different things that you have to do to have a good food safety / HACCP plan. And therefore, the auditor also had 17 separate sub-elements to look at now versus 5 or 6. So therefore, if he had maybe combined 2 things together under one sub-element before, he now has the ability to log those in as 2 separate things under 2 separate sub-elements. So I went in and looked to see which were the ones that were being cited the most. And they were 2.4.3.2, 12, and 13, and 14. And we'll talk about each of those separately now. Next slide, Holly. So what were the challenges with 2432? Proving to the auditor that the plan is based on valid scientific studies. When you say you're controlling a hazard, and you're going to control, and you're going to quote a temperature and a time, where did you get that from? Because you have to know it's valid. So unless you did your own studies, you're going to quote a regulatory requirement, you're going to quote some scientific study done by a university, you're going to quote some type of regulation or academic study. If not, you're going to have to quote your own study. Well, when the auditor asks you those questions, companies were going, I don't know. It was here when I got here. Well, remember now you got the FDA coming in and asking the same question, and they don't want to hear that answer because you are running the plan today, and you have to know how your plan is valid. Ensuring that the plan describes what has to be achieved at each CCP. You have to say that in words. What are you trying to do at that stage? Are you trying to prevent a hazard, eliminate a hazard, or decrease the amount of the hazard to make the food safe? Sometimes you're doing exactly the full thing. You're trying to get rid of the hazard, but you have to be able to explain that in your plan. And that's why if you see those food safety plans that the FDA is requiring now, they're not like a 5 or 6 page HACCP plan. They're 17 to 38 pages long. If you've gone to the PCQI training, you'll see how long those things are. And they have a lot of detail in them, but they answer all the questions. Make sure that your plan covers all the products. So if you combine them all together into one plan, can you justify that? Where's the justification? What if the auditor has a different opinion? What if the FDA has a different opinion that you can't combine them all into one plan? Wouldn't it be nice if you're one step ahead of being able to show your valid reasoning why you felt only one plan or 2 plans or 3 plans could cover 100 different products you make in your plant? And then how about your records? What else are the use of records to show that you're actually following this plan that you spent all this time putting together, that you said it's a valid plan, that it achieves the objective of a safe product, and the records show that you're complying with it, and then your records have holes in them. And your records also, if they don't have holes in it, will be used to show that the plan is effective because you keep doing it and never finding problems and never writing down numbers that show you're out of compliance. Therefore, your verify is very important here, that they are verifying the records that are being put together by your hourly employees or your QA people. And if all that's not there, then you can see the points are coming off, the FDA is going to get concerned. The FDA is going to start to say your food safety plan isn't what it needs to be. So again, I would be much more worried about the FDA or the USDA and the USDA plant than I would about SQF. Yeah, it's nice. You want to get a high score, so certainly go for that. But don't get into problems with the regulators, and certainly don't finish up getting people sick and getting involved with lawyers. Let's go to the next challenge. 24312, defining achievable limits at each CCP. Therefore, saying what temperature or what time or what pH or what water activity or what's the sensitivity on your metal detector if that's a critical limit, and defining how that critical limit can be measured in order to show compliance, and citing the basis of the validity of the critical limit at each CCP, and determining how the critical limit is going to be documented. That's why people were failing to get where they needed to be. They didn't understand their food safety plan. They didn't understand their hazard plan. They've never had this type of questioning. And yes, the SQF auditors asking more questions now than maybe they should have been asking in the past, because they know that when the FDA comes in, they're not going to pull any punches. They're going to be asking you really deep questions about the validity of your process, about your risk assessments, about why you picked something or why you said something wasn't a hazard, or how you know that that critical limit, which is usually time and temperature, when you're talking about temperatures, time and temperature, where did you get it from? How do you know it works? And you can't just say, I don't know. It was here when I came here. Let's go on to the next one. 24313, assigning by job title who's going to monitor it. The auditors were finding that nobody was actually by job title named. And you won't want to name an employee. Because if you name an employee, that means nobody else can do it except that employee. And that also means if you say the job title of that person and you only have one QA tech, that means the QA manager can't do it. So remember, what you got to do is you've got to say the job title, and then you say or designee, which means that anybody else who's been trained can do it if that person who's named in the food safety plan isn't available. But if you don't say or designee, believe it or not, the government isn't flexible. If you've only got one QA a technician, and they're not in, then basically that line has to stop. You have to determine how you're going to measure it. You have to determine the validity of the frequency of doing the testing when continuous monitoring is not possible. Now, in some cases it is. If you've got a probe in a line and you're heating something up and the probe's in there all the time measuring the temperature, then that's continuous. If you're putting everything through a metal detector, that's continuous. But that isn't always possible. You could have chickens coming out of a fryer, and you're not going to take every chicken breast and take a temperature on it, so you have to determine the frequency at which you're going to take temperatures on the chicken breasts. And you may pick one every 15 minutes, but what was the validity of that 15 minutes? You got to be able to prove that in between the 15 minutes that all of the other chicken breasts were at the right temperature. So therefore, you have to know what is the statistical process control. So if you haven't done statistical process controls, you really got a problem if you haven't done that training. Because you got to know the standard deviations on your food safety processes. How much deviation can you have either side? Plus or minus 1 degree, plus or minus 2 degrees, plus or minus this amount of pH, or etc. You've got to know that. And you got to build that into your plan. And so, yes, you have to have a lot more understanding and knowledge that you had to have in the past. But any of you going SQF quality, the whole thing on SQF quality is now based on statistical process controls as well. But let's stay with food safety. The FDA is going to come in and ask you, what is the deviation of your process? What is the normal deviation? How much does it move? 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations? And the other thing they're going to ask you is, what is the deviation probe that you're using to measure something? And did you build in that deviation so that in the worst case scenario, you're always meeting the requirements of the minimum critical limit? And all of this has to be in your food safety plan. It all has to be documented. So that's why I say a food safety plan isn't a 5 or 6 page document anymore. It's a 17, 20, 25 page document. So if your HACCP plan, which you're using as a food safety plan, is all you're doing, I'm going to tell you for FDA products that isn't sufficient, and those of you who went to PCQI training have heard that it's not sufficient. So it's not sufficient now for SQF either, or any other GFSI standard. Next slide, Holly. So which one does this say? This says food safety plan challenges, establish and written to cover all possible deviations. You got to have corrective actions. They got to be in there. What are you going to do if you suddenly find that your process deviated from where it needed to be? What are you going to do with all that unsafe product? What have you told your employees to do with it? And therefore, documenting what you require employees to do, it's got to be in there. It's got to be in the plan. And then when I question your employees, which again the FDA can do as well as the SQF auditor, they know what they're supposed to do versus they look at you like, I don't know, it never goes wrong. Well, that's great. It never goes wrong. But what would you do if it does go wrong? And then when it does go wrong, how do you do your root cause analysis? Which procedure do you use? You use the 5 whys? Do you use the fishbone? Who's had training in there? Because you now got to go and do root cause analysis because you got to get your process back under control and be able to show the SQF auditor and the FDA that you brought everything back under control. And all of that, with regard to the corrective actions, has to be written in your plan ahead of time. That's no different than what was required in a HACCP plan. Next one, Holly. So validation effectiveness. Some of these that tie in together. So let's go through this one. I'm trying to keep this so we don't get over our hour. We still have time for questions and answers. Obviously, validation effectiveness has been there for years in the SQF audit. And I'm not going to read this slide, but basically this is what it says here. So let's move on to the next one, which talks a little bit more specifically about the challenge. Again, development, documentation, verification schedule. How often are you going to verify things like your records? You have to do them within 7 working days for the FDA. USDA requires you have to do all of your food safety records before you even ship the product. You have to examine the frequency in order to demonstrate that your plan is robust and repeatable. You have to identify who's going to do that. Who's going to be the verifier of all these records, which usually is a different person than the person who's developing the records. What are you going to do when it's out of compliance? Who's going to verify that the product is put on hold and then is evaluated and then either scrapped, thrown away, reworked, or something else? And who's going to make sure that you confirm the effectiveness of the process? Is that the SQF practitioner or the internal audit team? And remember, all these records are now going to be looked at by the FDA. They can take copies of them, they can take them away. So you have to keep all these records now for 2 years or the shelf life of your product plus 1 year, whichever is longer. And these are the things the auditor was finding were not well documented under 252. And so points were coming off on the audits. Make sure that's not going to happen to you. And if they didn't catch it this year, make sure they're not going to catch it next year either when the auditor comes in next year. Next slide. So in summary, we wanted to leave enough time so we can have questions and I can try to give you answers. Obviously, the summary here was to try to bring up for you the top 5. It doesn't mean there aren't other issues that have been identified by SQF auditors. But certainly some of those things have come about because of regulation changes in the SQF code. There was no food fraud required prior to this year. The environmental monitoring has only been around for the last couple of years. You have to have a food safety plan now instead of a HACCP plan if you're making FDA products. And so some of these challenges are things that have come up in the last year or two. But some of them go back to basics that have been in the SQF code for years where people have somehow not given them the attention to building and equipment maintenance or something, and now they're having problems. So challenges are common, but they can be overcome with many resources. And we provided you with some of the resources, and I just want to say we have other resources where if you need help, we can help you. I leave that as a thought that we can give you help if you need it. And you don't know how to get to shore, then we're only too happy to try to give you some help. The idea here was to try to bring these to your attention. So, Holly, what type of questions have we got from people?
Well, we have lots of questions, Dr. Bob. Thank you very much for your presentation. Lots of positive feedback along the way here. We've received quite a few questions, so let's dive in here. How do you manage food fraud when you are a distribution center and receive all the material from your one customer to route to restaurants?
Well, food fraud, if your name isn't on the product, you don't have to worry about it, because if the product is owned by somebody else, then you are not going to be charged with being expected to have food fraud programs. But if you're handling your own product with your own name on it, then you're going to be held accountable for that. But distribution centers, food fraud is not a big thing, but it is not where you can just say it doesn't apply to me at all.
Okay. Can you just reiterate, Dr. Bob, you alluded to earlier the guidance document that SQFI has provided or has produced. It's accessible on the website now, is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. And the link is in the slide decks for the folks that have asked this question. You'll receive a link within the deck post-webinar here within 2 business days there. That's great.
And if you don't want to wait for that, you can just go to the SQF website, look on the documents, and you'll find it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you comment on how auditors, like how the industry will be sort of upskilling auditors to be educated on the environmental monitoring element? As we alluded to, there's lots of questions around this, Dr. Bob, and this one question is sort of, some folks are insisting it is a major event, even with a risk assessment. So how do you see the industry sort of preparing auditors for this?
I can only talk about what we're doing, the fact is that we have taken out auditors and given them some training. But it is, again, for them, an area that they're not as comfortable in, because, again, it's not been something that auditors have necessarily been very skilled in. They're getting better. And so I think one of the things you have to do is you have to basically try to discuss with the auditor when you feel they're out of line. Remember, you have an appeal process. The first appeal is to say, I don't agree with you. I can't see any evidence. Show me some evidence that says I have to do it. Show me some evidence I have to do it at this frequency, whatever the auditor is making an issue out of, and say, I'm going to challenge your finding if it stays in the report. Now, that's not to argue with the auditor, but a smart auditor then goes and gets a second opinion from his own technical advisor. And when he comes back and he got different advice from his advisor, he says to you, I'm not putting it in the report. If you still have it in the report, you can file a written appeal, and it can go all the way up to the certifying body. And after that, if you're still unhappy, you can go to SQF.
Okay, thank you for that. Would the HACCP hazard analysis results be suitable to choose what organisms to swab for?
Oh, yes. Obviously, it's based on what you think is the probability that a pathogen is going to be in that packaging room. And therefore, most companies won't do E. coli unless they're handling raw meat products, and because that comes obviously from fecal material, usually from animals. So most companies wouldn't do that. Some companies wouldn't even do salmonella if they can assess that salmonella isn't a likely pathogen they're bringing into the room. What you can't do is get out of doing listeria.
Yeah, okay. Can you just, a couple of questions around swabbing again. So can you comment on, and I'll list them all here, Dr. Bob, the frequency of swabs, and then some questions around sort of cleaning and sanitation. So if you need to swab before that, should you at least physically remove the visible residues? And sort of when, yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
No, you wouldn't remove anything. Just swab right through, because that's your food product and you find listeria in that residue on there, then you should be really worried, because it could be in your product. You're trying to get it, but I wouldn't do it on the food contact surface, because then you could say, well, I didn't find it on a food contact surface, so that's why I'm not holding my product. But you want to swab under the worst conditions. I can't get into too much depth because it is so specific to what type of product you make, what is your plant, et cetera, that I think it would take up the rest of the next hour if we get into too many specifics.
Yeah, sure. And I know we spoke earlier about potentially offering this topic as its standalone webinar in the new year, so we'll keep the folks informed of that. Can you comment on when to do the swab, before or after sanitation?
Well, before sanitation.
Yeah, okay. What if there is a regulation from another country, like a European country or even from Asia Pacific? How do we sort of fold those in?
You got to live with the requirements of whatever you sell your product.
Yeah.
So if those are different requirements, you can't be any less than what the FDA and USDA requires, but you can be more.
Yeah, okay. If pathogens cannot survive in a finished product due to its chemical composition, and this has been scientifically validated repeatedly, is this sufficient for an exemption to environmental monitoring?
Yes, the FDA lists that as one of the things. If you can prove that there's something in your product, added to your product, that will kill off the listeria prior to it getting into the hands of the consumer, then the FDA will accept that. I would just caution you to be sure that it does kill off the listeria before the consumer eats the product.
Yep. And can you comment on sort of the difference between the HACCP plans and how sufficient that is as it relates to the SQF code if you live in Canada? So not looking at the preventative controls rule and what they call HARP-C rule as it relates to FSMA. And the assumption is, the assumption is they don't export to the U.S., just to clarify.
Okay, if you don't export to the U.S., forget what I've said about the FDA and USDA. CFIA accepts a HACCP plan, and therefore, if CFI accepts it and you're only selling your product in Canada, then don't worry about having a food safety plan. But if you're selling your product into America, then you need a food safety plan.
Yep, I think you answered this previously, but I'll just ask it for due diligence. We have a supplier that is a distribution company. How does that apply to us regarding food fraud assessments?
On the product. If you are just distributing product for other people, then they're responsible for the fraudulent ingredients or fraudulent nature of the product that you're carrying, not you.
What about distribution facilities as it relates to environmental monitoring? Are they exempt?
Well, the question becomes, in the case of produce, that's a very gray area, and we're seeing the FDA sometimes going both ways on that with regard to swabbing in coolers where they've got ready-to-eat fruit in their produce, where they know that if the listeria is on it, then unless the consumer is going to somehow get rid of it, you're selling them an apple with listeria on it. They are tending to do some swabbing there. I'm not sure they made a hard and fast rule there. I would say try to be one step ahead of the regulator. Try to avoid cooling water in your coolers. Try to keep your coolers a little cleaner, even though they got produce in them than you maybe have in the past. Maybe do some swabbing in there just as investigating whether you've got any problems, and then hope and pray you don't find anything.
Yeah, okay.
If you don't have produce, don't worry about it.
You answered earlier that if it's not your brand, you don't have to worry about food fraud. But can you elaborate in the instance where a company co-packs several private label brands that they don't own, so they're not responsible for food fraud assessment for those products?
Well, again, if somebody is sending in the ingredient to you and they're the ones who are procuring it and you're packing it under their label, the answer would be no. It's the fraudulent is the person who's actually selling the product into the marketplace. What you've got to avoid is being a person who has your name on the product again.
Yeah, okay. So for food packaging, what requirements under environmental monitoring are mandatory? So this company manufactures lids for coffee, soda, smoothie, soup, etc. So they do not manufacture the cups, just the lids.
Well, that's an interesting question because actually FSMA doesn't apply to food packaging plants in America. It applies to food packaging plants outside America sending packaging materials into America. So environmental usually comes down to what your customers requiring of you, because if you've got listeria on a cup or in a cup or on a lid, and then they're going to put their ready-to-drink beverage into your cup, then you're going to be the source of listeria. It may come down to the fact that your customer requires you to do it more than the regulator requires you to do it.
Okay.
I think in the SQF audit, I didn't look that up. In the SQF audit, I don't think it's in the packaging audit. It talks about environmental monitoring.
Yep. Okay. Let me see here. Can you just reiterate, if we manufacture food packaging, are we required to comply with the food defense section, or do we need to file for an exemption?
Again, food packaging is covered under food defense. So
Under
yes,
food,
you
okay.
have to have a food defense program, because a way of contaminating a product could be to contaminate the packaging material, and I do it intentionally, knowing that you're going to put your food product in that packaging material. I think the probability is low, but you can't say it's non-existent.
Okay. Should you swab for listeria in a water bottling plant?
Yeah, because obviously it loves to live in water. So water is one of the ways that listeria will grow, and it can be in cold water, it can be in warm water, and it takes really getting the water hot for it to not be there. So I would say yes, that's a ready to eat, meaning ready to drink product.
Okay. Is environmental monitoring, swabbing for listeria a requirement? We swab for salmonella because that is a known hazard to be in dried spices.
Well, therefore, what you've done is you said that the justification for not doing listeria is that we're in a dry environment, and the FDA tends to agree that you're more likely to have salmonella as the elephant in the room than Listeria monocytogenes. But make sure you got that justified to be able to show why you decided not to do listeria.
Okay, very good. We are at the top of the hour. We have a few unanswered questions, so for those we have not answered a question to, we'll definitely reach out to you on a one-to-one basis. With that, I'll cap it up. Thanks everyone for your attendance. We'll send a link to the recording as well as the slide deck within 2 business days. And Dr. Bob, thank you very much for your presentation today.
My pleasure. Bye, everybody.